Today we're going to look at the maintenance of a Collins axle. That's C-O-L-L-I-N-G-E-S. They were used on larger and maybe more expensive vehicles. They were a system that the axle runs in oil. It doesn't run in grease. And one of the advantages was you could just take the oil cap off, fill it with oil, and put it back on, and your wheel would be lubricated. You didn't have to take the whole wheel off the carriage. So that's what we're going to look at today. This happens to be on a two-wheel vehicle, a gig. So it's important before you start is to make sure you block the opposite wheels, because once you take this wheel off the ground, the carriage is free to roll and it'll fall off your jack, possibly. If it falls off without the wheel, you got a big mess. So the tools that we're going to use today is we've got a wheel wrench, and they made wheel wrenches specifically for this kind of a vehicle. It's got a large hex to take the axle nut off, and it's got a small hex to take the inner nuts off. We'll see those later. You can also use your common tools out of your shop. This happens to be an 2 1/8 socket and a 1 1/16 inch socket for the inner nuts. So we'll see that later. Because this is in oil and it's rotating, that oil wants to leak out of there. So there has to be a seal on the front and the back of the wheel, and those seals are made out of leather washers. And over here we've got some examples of leather washers for different size vehicles. And the way you make those leather washers is with a fly cutter like this that has 2 blades on it. This becomes the center point, and as this turns, these 2 blades cut the OD and the ID of the washer. In this case, it would be like here, rotating, cutting out the OD and the ID. Most of these old tools are made for a hand brace, so you put them on there and turn them slowly with your hand brace. I took one and had it machined down to give me a concentric shaft with this point, and then I can put it into my drill press and turn it slowly, and it really does work much better than the hand brace. So we'll see where those are used in a minute. So first of all, we'll use the old wrench, the old style wrench, to take the oil cap off. And that fits over the diameter there and turns over. And when you take this off, there's probably going to be oil behind it. So I'm going to put my thumb on it to hold it there, and then when I get to the end thread, I can take it off and hold it vertically, not to drop that oil all over the shop. There is oil in this axle cavity in here, so it will want to drip out. So it's a good idea to have a rag handy and also have a rag for it to drip on the floor. You'll notice when I took this nut off, there was a leather washer behind it, and that's the seal that I was using the fly cutters to cut. That happens to be the one I've got on this wheel. We'll set that aside. Then there's the first thing that comes off is a cotter pin. It's a cotter pin that it really doesn't need to be bent over, because it's in there in a vertical position, and it really can't bounce out of there. It's held in there by the. So I just put a loose cotter pin in there. If it's bent over, you might have to have a pliers to pull that out. So now what you'll find inside of a collagen axle, which is much different than the common axle that we've looked at, is 2 smaller nuts. And those nuts they turn in opposite directions. One's a left-hand thread, one's a right-hand thread. And if you look at these finer vehicles, they are all match marked. This nut is marked, you might not be able to see it, 23. So I know you don't want to mix up these nuts, and you don't want to mix up the oil cap. So we took the first nut off. The second nut we can spin off. Again, these are all oily because it's running in oil. That's also marked 23. Sometimes they might be marked like 23 right and 23 left. But you want to keep the wheel on the same side, the nuts on the same side, the axle, the oil cap, and now there's a collar that's inside here. We're at the point now to take the wheel off. We got to jack up the vehicle. Again, jacks are made in lots of varieties. This one happens to work okay for this vehicle. It goes, car jacks will work, bottle jacks, whatever you might have, under the axle, and sometimes you want to pad that if you don't want to scratch your axle. And we just raised it off the ground. Now what we do is there's a collar in here that determines the clearance on that wheel. So when we pull this off, sometimes that collar will stick a little bit. Here it comes. The wheel comes off. You reach your hand in here and find that collar. Let me set the wheel aside for a second. So again, this collar, it's match marked for the side of the carriage that belongs on. And what you'll notice is it's got a flat on the top of the collar. It's got a corresponding flat on the top of the axle. So this doesn't spin. It sits on there like that. It was made by the carriage maker to be a specific distance from here to here, and that was the clearance on this wheel. If you have lost one of these and you try to find another one, you'll have a difficult time finding the right distance here. You may have the right bore size and the right flat, but this distance might require changing or shimming. So that's kind of the outer bearing for that wheel. When I took the wheel off, the inner washer came off with the wheel. That would sit there, and it would sit in the back bore of the wheel here. I'll leave it there. So what we want to do here is look at the axle, inspect it for wear. You can also, many times on the top of an axle like this, you'll find out the name of the maker of either the vehicle or the axle. And I know this vehicle was made by Demarest, and it looks like the axle was made by Danzel. So you see, this has had a little bit of wear, probably ran a little dry at one point or another. You want to get it nice and clean. You'll see it stamped up here is the number 23 again. So we know everything that was going on. On the top of an axle, there's this keyway, this groove, and I take a flat bladed screwdriver and just clean that groove out. what that groove is there for is as the wheel turns, there may have been some dust from the road that got inside the bore of the wheel. It'll come around and it accumulate in the groove, and it won't score up the axle. It's kind of a repository for the road debris. So if you get an old vehicle that you've just had a barn find, and you'll find that debris is in there and it's hard and crusty, and you have to really work to get that debris out of there. That's not the case here. It's been oiled and maintained. So that's a collinge axle, C-O-L-L-I-N-G-E-S. You'll see back here the oil is starting to kind of seep out. Sometimes you want to just lay a rag down there to keep your floor a little cleaner. All right, get back on. Mm-hmm. So now we have to do some maintenance on the bore of the wheel. I take a wooden dowel because I know I'm not going to scratch up the wheel in any way, and slide it through the bore and clean out any debris that might have accumulated in there. And then again, it depends on how long it's been since you cleaned your axle, but there isn't much in this because I know it's well maintained. If you're afraid of oil and grease in your hands, probably not the job for you. I know that the nut, the washers in the back of the bore here, just for convenience, I could take that out and put it on the axle. Some people will put a little grease on the axle just to make sure it's kind of pre-lubricated. Slide the wheel on. So now it's the reverse order going back together. The collar, the small diameter inward, the flat on top of the axle. So that will slide in there. Oh, I got them backwards. The inner nut. That gets snugged up. I want to check for clearance. The outer nut, notice I turned that the wrong way. It's opposite of the first one. Snug that up, and actually what it's doing is locking against that first nut. This guy acts as a lock nut. And a cotter pin slipped into the bore. That one's a little bit small. I think I'll go just a little bit bigger. Cotter pin in. So that's your wheel is back together now. You know it's clean. It's not oiled because the oil is in the oil cap. Again, the oil cap has got a seal on it here. The oil that we use is a multi-purpose gear lube. It's a heavyweight oil, so you put a real light oil in there, it'll tend to leak out more. This happens to be in 85 to 140. You don't fill the cap. You put maybe a third or less oil in there. And now this oil is free, so when you put this on, it's going to have a tendency to try to leak out on you. So what I do is I slap it up there, hopefully. Feel that first thread, maybe. Yeah, feel that first thread. There we go. You don't want to force that on. You don't want to cross thread it because it's brass and they're pretty. They won't take much cross threading to ruin your thread. So be careful when you put that back on. Tighten up the oil cap. It needs to be snug, but not extremely tight. You don't have to torque it in any means because you got a leather washer behind there. You're just squeezing that washer. Clean it up and put it back on the ground, and you've now lubricated a collinge axle.